Night on Nova, the Titanic. In 1912, the unthinkable happens when this unsinkable liner sinks. In the aftermath, Titanic's sister ship Britannic is built stronger, safer. But just 4 years later, Britannic goes down twice as fast. What went wrong? Today, an ambitious undersea explorer uses state-of-the-art technology to search the watery grave of Titanic's lost sister. Nova is funded by Prudential.
Prudential, insurance, healthcare, real estate, and financial services. For more than a century, bringing strength and stability to America's families.
And by Merck.
Merck, pharmaceutical research. Dedicated to preventing disease and improving health. Merck, committed to bringing out the best in medicine.
The Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and viewers like you.
Aboard this ship, moored off the island of Crete, an undersea exploration prepares to get underway. Oceanographer Bob Ballard, renowned for his discovery of Titanic in 1985, setting out to explore an intriguing wreck. Titanic's forgotten sister, Britannic. The expedition will need an impressive array of deep-sea technology, and Ballard does not travel lightly. Besides the crew of the support ship Carolyn Chuest, he has in tow 3 historians, 2 remotely operated vehicles, or ROVs, equipped with cameras, and a small U.S. Navy nuclear submarine, the NR-1. The object of the search has a remarkable heritage. Sister to Titanic, a ship whose fate still captures our imagination. Britannic is the last of a formidable trio built by the White Star Line in an effort to dominate the North Atlantic passenger trade. Her history is cloaked in intrigue. Britannic's sinking while serving as a hospital ship during World War I is still the subject of much debate. Was she the victim of a deliberate German submarine attack? Or did she hit a mine intended for a military target? The historians on board, Simon Mills, the only published author on Britannic, and Eric Sauter, an expert on the White Star Line, are hoping this expedition will resolve the mystery. A third expert, Ken Marshall, is the foremost illustrator of Titanic and other notable 20th century ships. The technical accuracy of Ken's work has made him invaluable to Ballard in past expeditions.
Yeah, this is a painting that I did about 5 years ago of the Britannic, as we think it may have looked to see a twin sister ship of the Titanic, virtually identical in most respects, her dimensions and so forth, to sense the size of that ship on the ocean floor, and particularly in a shallow enough depth where I can actually see the ship with filtered sunlight coming through the ocean. It should be an eerie and awesome experience.
So a course of 210 from his present position.
Ballard is also excited at the prospect of seeing Titanic's sister ship lying on the ocean floor.
That way they went by.
The discovery of Titanic was the highlight of his career. But since then, thousands of objects have been salvaged from the wreck site. Powerless to stop it, he has explored other wrecks in the pursuit of a personal vision.
I've been really searching for the optimum piece of history to experiment on and try to create the first undersea museum. I thought it might have been the Lusitania, but when we went out there, it was so tragic to see how destroyed it was. There's certain things we must preserve. I mean, the Titanic was incredible. The feeling, the power of going there was like going to Gettysburg the day after the battle. Why should I be the only one that gets to go to a place and as soon as I leave, it's level? That's what's really brought me here to the Titanic. It has not been pillaged. In very few years, the technology will make it possible for people in the luxury of their homes on the information highway to visit this site live. I would love to protect the ship, set it aside, and let people visit it. And I'm going to do it. I'm going to give it my best shot.
Ballard has gambled that after 80 years underwater, Britannic will be in good enough condition to display as the first undersea museum. Before he can determine that, he and David Olivier, the commander of the NR-1, must first locate the wreck.
Then your divers in the water. Put our divers in the water to put the cameras and strobes on. And then we'll get ready to do our first reconnaissance submergence.
The NR-1 and the Carolyn Suez make their way to the Kea Channel. Britannic lies 400 feet below the surface of the Aegean, off the island of Kea. Below decks on the support ship, the historians pore over the models of the ill-fated sister ships.
White Star struck out so badly with the big three.
But the work at hand cannot obscure the fact that for explorer and historian alike, the object of their search is not just another shipwreck. Britannic and her sisters possess a mystique. They are powerful symbols that speak to us from another time. The largest and most luxurious of their day, they were among the first of a new breed of superliner that would revolutionize transatlantic travel. While their upper decks catered to the wealthy, the real money was made down below in steerage.
Immigrants, millions of immigrants. By 1905 was the first million-passenger year for the North Atlantic liners, wanted to get from the old world to the new. And the only way they could go was by sea, and that accounts for two things. First, the enormous number of ocean liners that were built for the North Atlantic, and second, their incredible size.
Belfast, Ireland. In the deserted corners of the modern Harland and Wolff shipyard are visible reminders of the massive effort it took to build these very special transatlantic steamers. The pride of the White Star Line, Olympic, first of the class. Legendary Titanic. And lastly, Britannic, the forgotten sister. The magnificent interiors of these ships have either been lost to the ocean depths or dismantled. This room is all that remains.
We're in the White Swan Hotel in the interior of the lounge of the Olympic. It's all that we have left from her. There are bits and pieces of her all over England, but perhaps nothing quite as lovely as the lounge. And it's a splendid reminder of those fabulous days of 1911, 1912, before the war, before all these wonderful ships were swept away. The Gilded Era.
Despite the attention lavished on decor, It was also an era of technological innovation. Perhaps Harland and Wolff's greatest accomplishment was the simultaneous construction of Olympic and Titanic in just 4 years. At the time of their launching, their unprecedented size and luxury made headlines. But as we recall their story today, it was the failure of their innovative safety systems that captures our interest. The Olympic-class ships were designed with 15 transverse bulkheads extending above the waterline, creating 16 compartments separated by massive watertight doors. In the event of flooding, the captain could instantly close those doors from the bridge by means of an electric switch. An innovative backup system allowed the doors to be closed both manually and by a float mechanism. Damage could be sustained to any 2 adjoining compartments, or the first 4 starting at the bow, without endangering the ship. This system of safety features would prompt the most reputable of British shipbuilding magazines to call the Olympic class practically unsinkable.
That word unsinkable came actually from the great Bible of the British shipping industry called the Shipbuilder and Marine Engine Builder. This was the great journal of shipping that every new ship appeared in, and at lengthy articles were written about the ship and all the safety systems. And in this article, they talked about the watertight compartments, which every ship had. And it said if these doors were closed, it would render the ship practically unsinkable. Fair enough. Well, somebody grabbed unsinkable, not the White Star Line, out of that report and circulated it on both sides of the Atlantic as though Titanic were unsinkable.
It was an unfortunate label. As Britannic's keel was laid in Belfast, the greatest maritime disaster of this century would claim Titanic, and in the same moment alter Britannic's fate. Titanic collided with an iceberg on her maiden voyage and sank in less than 3 hours, taking some 1,500 souls with her, and making the limitation of her much-touted safety features tragically clear.
The iceberg came through here, started scraping along, scraping off rivet heads, buckling the plates, tearing the seams apart. Not a big gash like a can opener, but just a scraping that buckled the plates in. Went from here for about 240 feet or so aft, 2 feet into the coal bunker of boiler room number 5. The bow started to sink. The water eventually, inevitably, came up over that bulkhead and flowed into the next compartment and into the next. And it was just a mathematical certainty, plain and simple. No matter how you sliced it, the ship's going down.
Titanic was doomed. But why the staggering loss of life? The time it took for the ship to sink should have allowed ample opportunity to evacuate all on board. The disaster reached epic proportion because of a bureaucratic oversight. The Olympic-class ships had far too few lifeboats due to outdated Board of Trade regulations. The regulations had been written in 1894, when the largest ship afloat was considerably smaller than Titanic. Of the more than 2,000 passengers and crew on board, only 705 would survive. The disaster stunned the world. White Star immediately recalled the Olympic from service and halted construction on Britannic. Harland and Wolff set about correcting every flaw that might have contributed to Titanic's demise.
In the case of the Britannic, that was fairly easy to do because the ship had not advanced very far in terms of its construction. In the case of the Olympic, the reconstruction was so extensive that it took the ship out of service for 6 months.
The safety features of these 2 ships were completely overhauled. They were fitted with an inner skin that ran the length of the boiler and engine room compartments. 5 of the bulkheads were extended up as far as the bridge deck. These precautions would allow both ships to float with 6 compartments flooded, 2 more than Titanic. Belfast, February 1914. Britannic is finally launched. The new passenger liner was hailed by the shipping line and the builders to be as perfect a specimen of man's creative power as is possible to conceive. As the Britannic slid down the ways, a cataclysm was just around the corner. A war that would engulf not only Europe, but the world. Even as the last of her grand interiors were being installed, Britannic was requisitioned by the British Admiralty and transformed into a hospital ship. She completed 5 successful missions to the Mediterranean theater of war before sinking mysteriously on her 6th outbound voyage. Today, she lies at the bottom of a sea she was never intended to sail, a casualty of war. Her mysteries as yet unsolved. The object of Dr. Ballard's search. Tomorrow, Ballard will make his first dive on the Britannic.
Well, we're at the end of the first day, and we're transiting north from Crete, from the subbase we just left. And sometime tomorrow morning we'll arrive on scene. The ship was traveling northeast. It struck something, whether it was a torpedo in her mine. The captain immediately began to try to save his ship and beach it, so he began a quick turn to starboard and heading back to Kea, but before he got to the beach, he sank right there. This is where the British say they were sunk, and this is where Cousteau 20 years ago said he actually found the ship, so obviously we believe his position more.
In 1975, Jacques Cousteau made the first search for the Britannic. His discovery of the wreck was complicated by misleading coordinates reported by the British Admiralty in 1960, which were off by 8 miles. Yet another mystery surrounding this enigmatic ship.
But we've got to relocate it. We don't know exactly where it is. So the first and foremost, we'll transit over from the support ship, get in the sub, and go down and find it.
The support ship and the nuclear submarine have arrived in the Kea Channel and are now stationed over Cousteau's coordinates. Ballard boards the NR-1 for the first exploratory dive to locate the Britannic.
All right. All right, welcome aboard. Well, thank you. You ready to go? I'm ready. Let's do it. All right, let's dive.
The NR-1 is a one-of-a-kind submarine. A U.S. Navy ship designed to conduct scientific research and covert missions. Like all other U.S. submarines, the NR-1 has many secrets. What the Navy will acknowledge is a diving depth of 3,000 feet and a submerged speed of 3.5 knots.
Prepare to submerge.
The NR-1 is only 12.5 feet in diameter and 145 feet long, half the length of a Navy attack submarine. 2/3 of that space houses its nuclear power plant. The crew of 11 works, eats, and sleeps in the remaining 1/3. It's a little cramped. The submarine has cameras mounted on the hull, giving the search team many views of the undersea environment. But the real work of detection and navigation is covered by sonar. NR-1's deep submergence obstacle avoidance sonar has a classified range and frequency. Ballard hopes that if the Britannic is even close to this last reported position, this powerful sonar will detect it quickly. Sonar was essential to the 1975 expedition. After weeks of searching, Jacques Cousteau turned to Dr. Harold Edgerton of MIT and his new device, the side-scan sonar, for help. Edgerton discovered that by transmitting a sound pulse toward the ocean floor at an oblique angle rather than straight down as conventional sonar does, the signal would reveal much more detail about the ocean floor and anything that might lay on it. With the British Admiralty's coordinates so far off Britannic's true position, Cousteau may never have located the wreck without Edgerton's device. Side-scan sonar allowed Cousteau to locate Britannic and revolutionized underwater exploration.
And go down.
Over an hour into the dive, and still no trace of the ship.
This is an expanded display of that curve.
Right. Wait for a new there. That's the ship.
The sonar has locked on Britannic.
Looks like the rudder and propellers right there. That's the sweep of the hull. That would be the bottom. That would be the superstructure. So it looks like we're coming in on the stern. Okay, you're coming in this way. You're coming in from the northeast. Right. That sounds right. And we'll see whether we see a bow or a propeller. Yeah. That'll tell us. That looks like it's believable. Thank you, Mr. Cousteau. Captain.
These ghostly black and white images from the NR-1's cameras offer a tantalizing first look at this once proud Leviathan. The second-class smoking room where gentlemen would retire after dinner. The first-class promenade deck where society's elite were meant to stroll. The lifeboat davits, still in position to lower the boats. The individual images are promising, but they fail to give Ballard the overview necessary for an accurate picture of the ship's condition. For that, he will rely on the modern version of Dr. Edgerton's side-scan sonar. Printed out on board the Suez, the side-scan images are unrolled for all to see.
Look at that. Oh, wow, look at that. Oh, my God. Oh, my God. That's a photograph. Look at the bridge. Look at the docking collar. Docking bridge right there. Look at that.
Look at this. It even shows cables lying on the hull, the shadow of the cables, and every streak in the hull plating, which visually, for the submarine, you can hardly even make out.
The sonar's sophisticated imaging system reveals an amazing sight. The silhouetted shape of the Britannic in its entirety. Ballard and his team are elated.
It's yours from here.
You can go home. I know it. Look at this. The slightest little relief. Here's where you see the top of the davits, and that's where the compass tower shows up, right?
Oh, my God. Look at that. You can see through the rudder to the other propeller. Ken, you're out of a job.
This is the first evidence that Britannic is as well preserved as Ballard had hoped. Here lies a nearly intact version of Titanic.
Let's talk about what we're going to do next. So I would like to just get the NR-1 in position and go and image it for a while, you know. Put the NR-1 down and approach it, and then try to move down into the boat deck area, on that boat deck.
Now, these davits are here, though.
These davits are here.
Problem. You don't want to get...
You want to sort of... I'd like to be above the vehicle down and hold it.
Tomorrow, Ballard will return to the wreck with the remotely operated camera platforms for the first in-depth photographic survey of Britannic. The colored images of this once majestic ship should reveal a moment frozen in time. The moment of Britannic's sinking. It was 1960, fighting had spread from the trenches of Belgium and France to the Mediterranean. The struggle to control the Straits of the Dardanelles, a narrow passage linking the Aegean with the Black Sea, would claim tens of thousands of lives. As the tide of wounded swelled, the British Admiralty was faced with the task of transporting them back to England.
The ships that had been requisitioned for use, mainly Union Castle ships, were not providing adequate space to remove the sick and wounded.
The whole system, actually, in the Eastern Mediterranean was on the verge of breaking down. You have these 6,000 or 8,000 ton ships and literally thousands of casualties occurring during the course of a given week. So within a very short time, the largest ships available, Aquitania, Mauritania, and Britannic, are placed into hospital ship service.
On Britannic's return trips to England filled with wounded, every minute was devoted to patients. But on her outbound journeys, the medical staff had little to do, leaving time to enjoy the amenities of a first-class cruise. The sixth outbound journey started no differently. As they entered the Kea Channel, the mood was relaxed. But a dangerous and unpredictable threat lurked beneath the sea. The submarine. U-boats could strike without warning. They could fire torpedoes or lay underwater mine barrages. In either case, Britannic was defenseless. November 21st, 1916. At 8 a.m., the medical staff had just sat down to breakfast when, without warning,
There was a shudder that went through the ship. That's the way Sheila Mitchell described it. And she said that everybody froze.
Britannic had been hit. Had she been returning to England with her full quota of 3,000 patients, the loss of life would have rivaled Titanic's. But thanks to the efficient lifeboat system installed after Titanic sinking, most on board would escape. Sheila Mitchell, a nurse on the Britannic, was interviewed by Jacques Cousteau.
Everybody's heart was in their mouths. When she was turning, of course, I was thinking, oh, my trunks will be sliding under the other girl's bed. And all the oranges and lemons I bought in Naples will be on the floor. And where is my clock? You know, things like that.
The speed with which Britannic sank is one of her great mysteries. This period footage can only simulate the awe-inspiring sight of watching such a massive ship disappear. Britannic, a ship that was fully redesigned to benefit from the lessons of Titanic, somehow sank in a mere 55 minutes.
The Britannic was in the very early stages of her construction when the Titanic sank. They stopped the construction and rethought everything in order to make Britannic really, really safe. And they learned from the Titanic. They made the bulkheads much, much higher. They gave her a complete double hull, a double skin, so that it just covered all the bases. And here she went down in less than an hour.
For Simon Mills and Eric Sauter, the bigger mystery surrounds the cause of the initial explosion. A mine or a torpedo?
At the time of the sinking, everybody thought it was a torpedo. It had to be. You know, they were at war. The Germans, the filthy Huns, they wanted to sort of sink this ship. It was a powerful competitor after the war. They had to sink it, and torpedo was the only way to do it. As time went by, it wasn't quite so clear-cut. Even the English officer carrying out the inquiry decided that there was no definite evidence one way or another to say mine or torpedo.
I propose to drink to the Britannic, to the splendid ship that you have been on board.
60 years after her sinking, Jacques Cousteau gathered together Britannic's remaining survivors in an attempt to uncover what happened that morning.
What is your opinion? Was the ship torpedoed or did it see the mine?
Oh, torpedo, without a doubt.
Without a doubt, torpedo. Thank you. Now you, Miss.
Without a doubt, torpedo.
At least one torpedo.
My opinion is it got torpedoed.
I
by saltpeter.
It was a mine without a shadow of doubt.
Well, that way we don't have to do anything. We just get out of their way. They come in underneath us and reposition their pin on that.
The next and most difficult phase of the expedition will attempt to solve these mysteries. It will be the first joint operation involving the support ship, the ROVs, and the NR-1.
What do you think her turning rate is?
She couldn't turn by the rudder because she was disabled. She had to turn by the screws. So in fact, she probably turned quite a tight area, I think.
Ballard has promised the historians that he will try to explore the area where the explosion occurred. If the ROVs can maneuver into the damaged area, the hidden recesses of the gash might provide clues to Britannic's mysterious explosion and rapid sinking. As the ROVs are lowered over the side, the tension mounts. The NR-1 is in position, her powerful lights illuminating the wreck. Ballard and his team are in the command station on board the Carolyn Chouette. Monitors connected to the ROV cameras are the focus of the room. Ballard directs the ROV pilot who controls the depth, direction, and speed of the robot from a distance of more than 300 feet. All eyes are on the monitors, waiting for the first clear image of this once majestic ship.
There it is. We're at the hull.
Bigger, safer, more luxurious than her sisters, but destined never to carry a paying passenger.
Think of the millions and millions of hours labor put into these ships in Belfast, at Harland's Wall. Years and years of effort on the part of so many people. Iceberg is one thing. That's an act of God. But to have mankind blow up such a wonderful work, that's the way it's done.
Britannic's massive propellers, 23 feet in diameter, evoke memories of a gruesome incident. Following the explosion, the ship lay motionless. The captain, isolated on the bridge, was unaware that the crew had already begun to load lifeboats. In a last-ditch effort to save the ship, he gave the order to start up the propellers and head for nearby Kea Island.
They wanted to beach the boat where there was sand, the other side of the island. And so the minute we touched the water, she went on, and the propellers were coming up.
And turning.
At the turning, and at the back it was a whirlpool. The lifeboat in front of me and the one behind were drawn in by the propellers, a couple of ribbons. If anybody escaped from those boats, it was because they jumped out and perhaps could swim away.
One near casualty of the propeller incident was Nurse Violet Jessup. Her story is remarkable as one of the few known to survive passage on all three White Star sisters.
Violet Jessup, whom I had interviewed for a book, told me that she was not only on the Titanic when it went down, she was also on the Olympic when it had not a very serious accident, but there was a collision in Southampton water. Then the hat trick that she was also on the Britannic as a nurse's aide is extraordinary. Violet told me that she got into a lifeboat which was lowered down, and when it reached the water and was cast loose from the blocks, the descending blocks, she suddenly saw everybody jumping out. So Violet jumped over the side and thought she was going to sink forever, and finally came up and hit the bottom of the lifeboat. Her head hit as she came up. Then she groped around in the dark, thinking her end was nigh, and found a hand, a man's hand, which she could tell was alive, and they held the hands together and came up to the surface.
Leaving the propellers behind, Ballard guides the ROVs toward the bow for the first look at the most dangerous part of the wreck, the jagged gash caused by the explosion. The damage, depicted by Marshall based on Cousteau's accounts, gives Ballard reason for concern. The jagged hull plating could easily sever the ROV's umbilical cord.
There's the beginning of the gash. So now go left and drive the gash line down to the left.
Marshall and Mills have switched to the second ROV monitor for the long-anticipated look at the damaged hull. The images from this ROV, NASA's Voyager, are in stereo, and with the 3D glasses, the two experts can see much more detail.
I think that if it's buckled in and then buckled out, that must have been the impact that hit the deck.
The bow is buckled off to the starboard side, and we're just seeing that stub toe effect of it, just the bow buckled in and twisted, and the rest of the ship just bent apart, buckled and collapsed into the sand. So we're seeing this 30, 40 foot wide gap down at the keel level. It looked as if it was at the bilge. It looked about 30 or 40 feet wide. And it can't be the damage actually caused by the minor torpedo, because the ship would have sunk in 5 or 10 minutes with a hole that huge.
The massive damage caused as Britannic's bow impacted with the ocean floor obscures all traces of the initial hole caused by the explosion. There is no evidence here that can shed more light on the issue of mine versus torpedo, but the gash may hold the answer to a different question. Did Britannic's watertight doors fail to close? A single mine or a torpedo of that era would have damaged no more than 1 or 2 compartments. The watertight doors should have contained the flooding, allowing the ship to float indefinitely. But she sank in less than an hour. What went wrong? The evidence is buried deep inside the gash.
And right. Okay, go over there. In the clean area. Go to clean water. Go back. Kick back. Now.
Ballard has pulled the ROV back from the wreck after a close call. The watertight doors the team wants to see are deep inside the wreckage.
More. Stand down.
But Ballard does not want to risk losing an ROV on a second attempt.
This side has a large shifted area of hull. It comes down right here, and then it like comes up on a different plane, and there's this large section that sticks out maybe like that. This is very festooned with...
The historians, denied an in-depth investigation, must piece together the disaster with the existing ROV footage and eyewitness accounts.
It was a Britannic. Effectively, she was a commissioned ship in the Admiralty in a war zone, and she was traveling with the doors open. It should never have happened. The only thing we can assume is that round about 8 o'clock in the morning, when the damage occurred, the explosion, the watertight doors must have been opened so that the firemen could change their watch. Now, the firemen normally bunked in the forward ends of the ship and maybe some aft. And to get to their boiler rooms, they would walk down a fireman's tunnel into these specific compartments, all 6 along here. Now, come 8 o'clock in the morning, when the watch changes, the doors would have been opened so that they could get through with a minimum of fuss, which is fine, no problem. But unfortunately, the Britannic happened to hit whatever she hit at the exact wrong moment.
But even if the doors were open when the flooding began, they should have closed automatically.
Maybe when the explosion occurred, the bulkhead of the watertight door was then shifted slightly, so the jam went out of alignment so the door couldn't be forced closed.
Ballard's ROVs reveal another possible clue to Britannic's rapid sinking. Many of the lower portholes were wide open.
A number of portholes along this particular deck here should not have been open, but they were. Now, strictly speaking, they should not have been, but it was a case of they were arriving at Madras later that morning. They were airing the ward for the patients who would be going in there.
As the ship settled by the bow and listed to starboard, it brought the portholes underwater, which let water into the undamaged compartments.
If these theories are correct, then all of the carefully designed safety features installed after Titanic were undone by human error. Operating in a war zone, Britannic was an accident waiting to happen. The final and most dramatic mystery remains. Was Britannic's sinking accidental or deliberate? As a hospital ship, Britannic was protected by the Geneva Convention. Would a German U-boat commander deliberately torpedo a Red Cross ship? Cousteau's team suggested that Britannic might have been carrying an illegal cargo of armaments and munitions. If true, this would account for the British Admiralty's desire to obscure the exact location of the wreck.
Why was the wreck so badly misplaced? I mean, 8 miles is quite considerable when you consider there are very easily identifiable landmarks in sight. Basically, the theories that are coming up are the Admiralty deliberately misplaced the ship so that there could be no exploration. Had divers gone down, they may have found the Titanic was indeed carrying weapons, which he should not have been.
Within the many hours surveying the wreck, Ballard found no trace of armaments. With no evidence of a motive, does the torpedo theory still make sense?
I say torpedo.
Torpedo. Torpedo.
Torpedo. Torpedo.
To the survivors, it certainly did.
One thing we mustn't forget about the First World War, in Britain in particular, was the absolutely rabid paranoia about what the Germans would do. So the consensus was, when the Britannic went down, which not many people knew, you see, don't forget this was cloaked in wartime secrecy. This was not something that was as publicized as the Titanic loss. The perception was that it was somehow a German torpedo. Now, beastly as they used to say the Germans could be, I don't think they would have torpedoed a hospital ship.
Yet in February 1915, the hospital ship Asturias was attacked with torpedoes in the English Channel. The ship took evasive action, but in this case, the markings of a hospital ship were no defense against an overzealous U-boat commander.
It was after the war that things began to be a little bit clearer. Among the captured German papers, there was evidence that the U-73, a German long-range mine-laying submarine, had laid mines in the Kier Channel at the end of October. Now, that was a full month before the Britannic was in the area, but it would appear that this particular barrage was in exactly the same place that the Britannic was sunk.
The German submarine logbook provides the strongest piece of evidence to counter the torpedo theory.
The U-73 belonged to a class consisting of U-71 through U-80. And these were relatively small submarines, and they were mine layers. They were not really known for their torpedoing capabilities, although they did have some.
Commander Gustav Zeiss's logbook, made public after the war, gave precise coordinates for the placement of 12 mines in the Kier Channel. The U-boat dove to a depth of 65 feet to avoid detection.
We also have the interview done by British intelligence services of a prisoner of war. He said, without any doubt, the Britannic had hit a mine that had been laid by the U-73.
If Britannic were sunk by a mine, then evidence should remain on the ocean floor in the form of an anchor and chain that were used to hold the mine in place.
This is the mine, the type of mine that the U-73 laid just before the Britannic passed through this channel. This is what the Germans claim the ship hit. And the British naturally said it was a torpedo. And so if we find this, and around it debris, particularly from the bow, then it'll pretty well ice it that it hit a mine. So we have an idea.
In pursuit of this physical evidence, Ballard will rely on a method of undersea investigation that enabled him to find Titanic when so many before him had failed. The debris field theory.
Everyone sees ships sink. You see the World War II movies and a torpedo and the ship goes up in the air, goes down. You never think about what happens after it goes up. And so instead of just falling straight to the bottom, which most people would assume, what happens is the ship breaks up. In the case of the Titanic, it broke in half. And all of these objects went into the water. Some were very heavy, like a safe, and some were very light, deck chairs, gloves, shoes.
Ballard found that the underwater current created a systematic trail of debris stretching for more than a mile. This breakthrough enabled him to try a new approach in searching for Titanic.
I realized that I don't want to look for the Titanic. It's only 94 feet wide. I want to look for its debris trail. And it fell 12,000. In other words, could I be looking for something that was a mile long instead of 94 feet wide? Well, that's a totally different strategy.
Ballard's decision to search a wide area for this fallout rather than a narrow one for the ship itself led to the Titanic. In the case of her sister, the logic will be reversed. Since Britannic traveled some 55 minutes after the impact, there should be a clear trail of debris leading from the wreck to the anchor chain. The U-boat commander's coordinates and Britannic's last recorded position are added to the equation to help determine the search area.
This is probably the same strike right here.
The next step is to send the NR-1 around the wreck to find the start of the debris field. The ROVs are ready to photograph anything the NR-1 might find. An hour passes, and then an exciting discovery. The NR-1 finds Britannic's gigantic funnels virtually intact, strewn in a distinct path leading away from the ship. Funnels are a rare find at a wreck site. The ship's smokestacks, their enormous size belie their fragility.
Funnels have been known to just be swept away in strong winds and heavy seas sometimes on ships. So they're not like the hull itself. It's really strong, very thin metal. I'm amazed that they're still intact, that they aren't fine, that they're not corroded away. I'm amazed. Yeah, very rare. 4 Britannic funnels still virtually intact.
But are they the start of the debris trail?
We looked at these two, and then we went out and saw a single funnel. If we go back through the, sight along from the center of the wreck to this funnel and this bunch of funnels, and then the next one out there, that would start us on the trail toward the course the ship was taking, and could lead us back through the debris trail to the spot where the mine, we think it was a mine, actually blew up.
With the Carolyn Suez due back in port, time is short to follow this promising lead. Ballard gives the NR-1 instructions to follow the funnels and head toward the U-boat commander's coordinates. The submarine sets off on what Ballard and his team hope will be the Britannic's debris field.
You can see the little squares going this way.
The NR-1's cameras are trained on the ocean floor, searching for telltale pieces of hull plating. The hours pass.
target's about 5.5 miles.
The NR-1 returns with disappointing news. The search has revealed no trace of an anchor chain. In the command station of the Suez, the historians review the hours of videotape brought back by the submarine, hoping to find some clue that might have been overlooked.
Now, there's another one of those cylindrical things.
Look at this. I mean, you've got a perfectly square, or
Maybe
a perfectly rectangular.
Maybe it's a flip?
It's just like the thing we saw before. All these things, nothing has to do with mines, and nothing has to do really with...
Well, that's the interesting thing. We've not found one trace yet of anything to do with the submarine which we know was there.
No.
We know she laid the mines. We know she laid 2 barrages of 6 mines, and yet all the scans we've done so far indicate nothing at all.
To my mind, it's a simple matter of taking a compass and drawing 1 mile radiuses or radii out from the wreck site, and we may be just looking too close to the wreck. I mean, it's got to be at least 2 miles away to the south or to the southwest where these mines were.
The only conclusion we can come to is that the German captain, Gustav Seiss, probably got his position wrong. I have a feeling that they're a bit further to the southwest, somewhere down there.
No anchor chain, no debris field, and no more time to search. Without conclusive evidence, the question of whether or not Britannic was the victim of a vicious attack or an unlucky casualty must remain open to speculation. But Ballard is far from disappointed. His vision extends beyond this expedition.
There's something mystical about a great ship like this. It's sort of like to solve everything is to make it no longer important. No, I'm real happy. Having been disappointed by the Lusitania, having gone out to find this perfect ship and to find something that was far worse than the Titanic, far worse, just destroyed, a pile of junk in the bottom of the ocean, to then come and find that perfect ship. I mean, this is the most perfect ship of this vintage. I mean, you'll certainly sink one tomorrow and it'll look prettier, but this is the most perfect ship I've ever seen. I think the Britannic, when everyone sees how well preserved it is, it'll lead the way, and then I will move into the next phase.
Of all the wrecks Ballard has explored, none have offered as much potential for his plan to create an undersea museum as Britannic.
In the memory of those who perished in the sinking of the HMHS Britannic, November 21st, 1916, and dedicated to all those who lost their lives in the War of 1914.
This commemorative plaque is a point of honor for Ballard, who firmly believes that wreck sites should be left undisturbed. The only mark of his passage will be this token of respect for those who perished here. For all of our technology, the oceans of the world remain largely unexplored. Their dark floors littered with forgotten relics of human history. And even those clues that are brought to light keep a jealous hold on their secrets. If Britannic someday offers us a virtual window into her past, it will be the lure of those secrets that will keep us coming back.
Is there an unsinkable ship? From Titanic to today's luxury liners, NOVA investigates blueprints for safety at sea. Dive into NOVA's website at pbs.org. Stay tuned now for the equally tragic story of the Britannic sister, the Titanic, coming up next. Followed at 10 o'clock by the Gulf War on Frontline. All tonight on TV 12. To order this show for $19.95 plus shipping and handling, call 1-800-255-9424. And to learn more about how science can solve the mysteries of our world, ask about our many other NOVA videos. NOVA is a production of WGBH Boston. NOVA is funded by Merck.
Merck, pharmaceutical research. Dedicated to the needs of an aging society. Merck, committed to bringing out the best in medicine.
And by Prudential.
Prudential, insurance, healthcare, real estate, and financial services. For more than a century, bringing strength and stability to America's families.
The Corporation for Public Broadcasting and viewers like you.
This is PBS. In the deep, colorful, shapeless, invisible, poisonous, and more intelligent than you think. We're going to have a close encounter with the cephalopods, an amazing race of sea creatures which includes the vampire squid from hell. This incredible sucker and others will be eyeing you next time on Nature.
Sunday night at 8 on TV 12.
Hi, I'm Chris Dussel, inviting you to the Antiques Roadshow, where people like you meet experts from America's top auction houses.
Do you have any idea what these items could be worth?
I have no idea. Coming to you this week from Philadelphia.
Friday at 9 p.m. Then, take a postcard trip across Pennsylvania. But it's more than just a travel love. It's the Pennsylvania Roadshow, Friday at 10, right here on TV 12.
February on The American Experience. 3 stories about the technologies that shaped this century. America Gets Wired, the telephone, Monday, February 3rd. A farm kid from Utah develops television, Big Dream, Small Screen, Monday, February 10th. And building the world's largest subway system, New York Underground, Monday, February 17th. That's February on The American Experience.
There have been many maritime disasters, but none have caught the public imagination in such a dramatic and lasting way as that of the Titanic. She was the pride of her company, the White Star Line. She was the biggest ship in the world. Yet her collision with an iceberg on her fateful maiden voyage and her sinking, with the loss of some 1,500 lives, sealed her place in history. The tragic events of April 1912 are unforgettable. Never again would men feel so confident in technology. It was claimed in the press that she was unsinkable, and her sinking left valuable lessons to be learned. The legend of the Titanic lives on and grows with each retelling. But let's return to the early years of the century and trace the birth of this great liner and her sister ships, for she was one of 3. In the Edwardian era, Britain was building 50% of the world's merchant ships. Her shipbuilding and railway engineering were unsurpassed throughout the world, and her worldwide possessions made the British Empire the greatest the world had ever seen, the empire on which the sun never set. The most lucrative trading route was that with North America, and the North Atlantic became both the major sea route and the most important for passenger trade. At that time, there were no restrictions on emigrants from Europe entering the New World, and thousands made the crossing. Britain vied, chiefly with Germany, to build the biggest, fastest, and most luxurious liners, and so capture both the well-to-do travelers and the bread-and-butter emigrant trade. By 1906, Germany had both the largest liner, the Kaiserin August Victoria, at 24,581 tons, and the fastest, the Kaiser Wilhelm II, with a speed of 23.6 knots. Britain outshone them both in 1907 with the Cunard liners Lusitania and Mauretania, both at 32,000 tons and speeds of over 26 knots. They were built with subsidies from the Admiralty, who wanted to regain British prestige and prevent Cunard from being taken over by an American combine, the International Mercantile Marine Company, the IMM. The subsidy also meant the two liners could be adapted in time of war as armed merchant cruisers. Already under American financial control was the Oceanic Steam Navigation Company, more popularly known as the White Star Line. This company had opted out of the race to build the fastest liners and chose comfort and safety as their priorities. The American backing enabled the company to embark on an ambitious plan to produce a trio of liners to provide a weekly Atlantic service. They would be the largest, most luxurious and safest ships in the world, 50% larger than the Cunard giants. They were to be called Olympic, Titanic, and Gigantic, the last being eventually named Britannic. On July the 1st, 1907, the order for the first two ships was placed with Harland and Wolff of Belfast. They were given the shipyard numbers 400 and 401. Major changes were needed as the Queen's Island ship. 3 existing slipways were demolished and 2 new ones laid in place. These were straddled by country, giving clear spaces of 100 feet between rows of supporting towers. The 840 feet long gantry was surmounted by a of 135 feet of lifting capacity of 3 tons. 10 race with lifts and ramps to transport men and materials to the various levels of construction. A large floating crane purchased from Germany, and the construction of a new dry dock commenced. The number of employees at the shipyard doubled to 11,300 during the building and fitting out of the 2 immense liners. The designer of the ships was Thomas Andrews. He was the nephew of Lord Pirrie, chairman of Harland and Wolff, and was a well-connected member of Irish society. He worked with his deputy, Edward Wilding, using a drawing office full of draftsmen and a huge model of the proposed class of ship. The keel of the Olympic was laid on January the 1st, 1909, and that of the Titanic on March the 16th. The construction of the 2 massive hulls progressed apace. The Olympic a few months ahead of the Titanic, to ease pressure on the shipyard production shops. On October the 20th, 1910, the Olympic was launched. She was painted grey to allow press photographers better views of the liner, and the launch took just 62 seconds. She was then towed to the new deep water quay for fitting out, leaving the black-painted Titanic still caged in her surrounding gantry. These new vessels were designed to have service speeds of 21 knots. The engines generated 55,000 horsepower. Cunard had opted for marine turbines to propel their record breakers, but Harland and Wolff adopted their favorite combination: reciprocating engines to drive the 2 23 feet 6-inch diameter outer propellers, the steam from which then exhausted into a low-pressure turbine which turned the ahead-only 16 feet 6-inch center propeller. Providing steam for the engines were 24 double and 5 single-ended boilers, containing 159 furnaces. 7 months after her launch, the great ship was ready, and after 2 days of successful sea trials, the Olympic finally left Belfast on May the 31st, 1911. This was a brilliantly timed publicity exercise, as the Titanic herself was finally launched on that same day. For this occasion, the landward end of the building gantry was decked with 1 Union Jack and 1 Stars and Stripes, with a White Star pennant in the center, below which code flags spelled out success. About 100,000 people watched as, just after noon, the liner, urged on by hydraulic rams, slid backwards into the River Lagan. There was little ceremony, as was the White Star custom. Later, when the Britannic was launched, a retired shipyard worker recalled, "They just builds them and chucks them in." In just 62 seconds, she slid into the water and was brought to a halt by the tons of drag chains attached by cables along her hull. The following day, June the 1st, her sister ship anchored in the Mersey off Liverpool, the traditional home and port of registration of the White Star Line. It was her only visit to the Mersey, for she then headed for Southampton, the line's main port since 1907, where the London and South Western Railway had built a new large dock to accommodate this new class of wonder ship, twice the size of the 20,000-ton liners the port had become used to. The dock, known as the White Star Dock until the late 1920s, is 1,700 feet long, 400 feet wide, enclosing 16 acres of water. It was later to be used by such liners as the Queen Mary, the Queen Elizabeth, and eventually the new QE2. Harland and Wolff had built a ship repair works at Southampton, but major repairs would have to be done in the new dry dock back at Belfast. The Olympic set sail on her maiden voyage at noon on Wednesday, June the 14th. Her captain was Edward John Smith, their premier Atlantic captain and destined for command of her sister ship. Also on board was J. Bruce Ismay, the company's managing director. He was preparing a meticulous report on the ship's layout, fittings, and service, and many alterations to these provisions were subsequently made on the Titanic. The biggest changes were to be on Bridge Deck B, with luxurious parlor suites extending to the ship's side, thus removing the promenade from much of its length and increasing the gross tonnage by 1,004 tons. A reception hall by the aft grand stairway, a large restaurant with sea views, and a café parisien, complete with trellis work and growing ivy. Both ships had electric lifts, swimming baths, the first afloat, Turkish baths, squash courts, and gymnasia. But the Titanic acquired the reputation of being more luxurious because of these many improvements. Richly carved paneling, stained glass windows, deeply piled carpets, and many other fitments of both luxury and necessity were bringing the Titanic to completion. She would be a floating palace. But completion, and ultimately the date of her maiden voyage, was delayed, owing to the return of the Olympic to Belfast following a collision near Southampton with the cruiser HMS Hawke on September the 20th. The Hawke's bow was badly damaged. The hole in the Olympic was 40 feet high and extended 8 feet into the ship. There was a second hole at the waterline caused by the cruiser's beak-like ram. Some witnesses claimed the huge bulk of the liner caused an undertow, which sucked the smaller ship into her side. This phenomenon was later to cause a near accident on the Titanic's departure from Southampton. The Olympic was taken to the new dry dock at Belfast, and men were taken from fitting out the Titanic to speed the repairs. On February the 24th, 1912, Olympic returned again for repairs to a propeller. Eventually, following these delays, and 11 months after her launching, the Titanic was at last ready for sea trials. One final modification had been to enclose and glaze her forward promenade on A deck. On Olympic, this section of promenade was prone to wetting by spray. This gave the Titanic a visual feature distinguishing her from her sister. Trials began on June the 2nd in the Irish Sea under the command of her captain, Edward John Smith, who had left the Olympic in Southampton and travelled to Belfast. He had taken his finest and final command and took the ship on to Southampton. Still, with last-minute interior work in progress, she was not opened to the public for inspection, as was the custom. The ship was thoroughly inspected by a Board of Trade representative. The brand-new lifeboats were lowered and rowed around in the dock to the inspector's satisfaction before being hauled back on board. They were maneuvered by the Welin type of davit, and although these could each handle several boats in succession during an emergency, the actual number of lifeboats fitted on the Titanic complied to a Board of Trade ruling made 20 years earlier. This stated that a ship of 10,000 tons or over, a large ship in the late 19th century, should carry 16 lifeboats. But the Titanic was 46,000 tons. White Star, in fact, provided 4 extra in the form of Engelhart collapsible boats with planked bottoms and collapsible canvas sides. The number of passengers was not considered, just the letter of the law. In fact, this was only half the number of lifeboats required to accommodate a full complement of passengers and crew in the event of a disaster. Captain Smith was the White Star's senior captain. For many years, he had taken White Star vessels on their maiden voyages. He was born on the 27th of January, 1850, in Hanley, Stoke-on-Trent. He was the son of Edward Smith, a potter and later a greengrocer, and Catherine Smith. He was educated at a Trurier British school, one of the first day schools in the potteries. One of his first jobs was as a steam hammer operator at a Trurier forge, but he left the area at the age of 21 to join the mercantile marine. His progress was so swift that he captained his first ship when he was 24 years old. In an outstanding career, he eventually became commander and commodore of the White Star Line. His employers had absolute faith in his skill and judgment. His career had been unblemished by any accident apart from the incident on the Olympic. He was a tall, distinguished, quietly spoken man, and, coming up to retirement, the Titanic was to be the pinnacle of his career. Since January 1912, the country had been in the grip of a coal strike, causing many liners to be laid up and putting 17,000 men out of work in Southampton. By April, the strike was on its last legs, but to enable the Titanic to set sail, coal had to be taken off other ships laid up in the docks, the White Stars Oceanic and Majestic, and the New York, Philadelphia, St. Louis, and St. Paul of the American line. On Wednesday, April the 10th, hundreds of passengers and crewmen boarded the Titanic. It was a bright, sunny day. The boat train from London brought the well-to-do, including the millionaire Benjamin Guggenheim and William Stead, editor of the Pall Mall Gazette, who was going to America on the invitation of President Taft to deliver a speech at the World Peace Conference on April the 22nd. All levels of society were represented on this palace ship. Some passengers were transferred from the laid-up IMM ships. Eva Hart and her family were originally booked on the Philadelphia.
We were booked in a ship called the Philadelphia. And this coal strike came and she didn't sail. And we were then offered a berth in Titanic, which absolutely delighted my father. I thought it was wonderful. The whole world was talking about that ship. And my mother had this dreadful premonition. She'd never had one before, and she never had one after. But she said, no, we can't do this. It's quite wrong. Something dreadful will happen. And I tell you what, the sort of woman she was. She'd got both feet on the ground, and for her to behave like that was absolutely unbelievable to everyone. But she just had that premonition. I was certain. I'd read that it was a big ship. It didn't really convey as much to us as it did to my parents, obviously. I mean, I'd never been in a ship at all before, so it didn't convey very much to me. But I do know everyone was talking about it.
At noon, the ropes holding the liner to the quay were cast off, and 6 tugs slowly pulled her away from the quay. There were cheers from the assembled crowd, the waving of handkerchiefs, and the shouting of last-minute messages between ship and shore. The Titanic moved out into the River Test and began to move under her own steam, her 3 screws powerfully pushing her 46,000 tons slowly forward. But she displaced such an amount of water in the channel that the liner New York, moored alongside the Oceanic, broke her moorings and drifted out sternwards towards the giant ship. Captain Smith and pilot George Bowyer stopped the central propeller and ordered the outer propellers to be set at full astern. This stopped the New York when she was only 12 feet from the Titanic's stern and brought the great ship herself to rest. The tug Vulcan placed herself between the vessels, had ropes thrown onto the New York, and as the Titanic now moved backwards a little, towed the New York round the dockhead corner into the River Itchen and out of trouble. This near collision was seen by many as a bad omen and put another, if only slight, delay in her departure. The liner proceeded down Southampton Water, passing Hythe to starboard and Western Shore, Netley, with its ruined abbey and huge military hospital, to port. She passed the mouth of the River Hamble and finally rounded Cowshot Spit and then into the Solent. In glorious sunshine, the Titanic sailed out past Cowes and the Isle of Wight and into the open sea towards Cherbourg, where she was to arrive at 6:30 p.m. to take on more bags of mail and passengers. These included more millionaires, such as John Jacob Astor and his wife, and various socialites, some seeing the maiden voyage of the world's largest liner as a good way to end their European holidays. Now she turned westward through the English Channel to call at Queenstown, now Cove, in Ireland, just before noon on April the 11th. More mail bags were taken on, and some mail and passengers delivered to the Irish port. Remaining on board the Titanic, the 322 first-class passengers, 277 second-class, and 709 third-class, making her about half full, and 898 crew members. 3,814 sacks of mail had been loaded, and this would partly be sorted in the Titanic's own post office. She weighed anchor at 1:30 p.m. and headed out into the Atlantic towards New York. Life on board an ocean liner consisted of eating and occupying one's time between meals as best one could. The first-class passengers had the ship's 5-man band, led by Wallace Hartley, to entertain them. Hartley had previously played on the Mauretania and other prestigious liners. The band played everything from Strauss and Offenbach to the stately Jacobean Room to ragtime and cakewalks for afternoon dances. separate trio played in the restaurant's reception room and Café Parisienne. A piano was provided for the use of the third class, and an Irish piper and fiddler would play for their communal dancing. Ball games in the forward and aft well decks were popular with the third class. These could be seen by spectators from the other classes on the tiers of decks above them. These others had space enough for deck tennis, shuffleboard, or promenades round the wide boat deck. Inside, there were first and second class libraries and games rooms. To cater for over 2,000 people at sea for 6 days, head chef Mr. C. Proctor had stored inboard 75,000 pounds of various meats, 25,000 pounds of poultry, including quail, pheasant, chicken, turkey, and plover, 15,000 bottles of beer, and 1,000 of wine, 1,000 pounds of tea, 2,200 pounds of coffee, and tons of fruit, vegetables, jams, and other items. In third class, the food was basic but plentiful. People said that third class on the Titanic was as good as first class on any other liner. There were 2 dining rooms for first class, the Jacobean room and an a la carte restaurant with the adjoining Café Parisienne, the latter 2 being run by Monsieur Gatti and his staff on behalf of the White Star Line. The bugler sounded the call for dinner in the evening. During the voyage, the weather remained fine, the sea calm, but with a chilling breeze. It was to get colder on Sunday, April the 14th. In the radio room, ship-to-shore contact was made possible again as the ship came in range of Cape Race, and the operators were kept busy with current messages and the backlog which had built up through a breakdown of the system 2 days previously. Ice warnings had been received during Sunday by the 2 Marconi operators in the radio room, Jack Phillips and his assistant, Harold Bride. Their prime job was to transmit and receive private messages, known as Marconigrams, stock exchange information, and news. These private messages bringing the company its revenue. Official messages received for the ship indicated that there was pack ice and large and small icebergs in the shipping lanes, although it was not appreciated that these warnings represented one huge ice field. Messages to the ship itself were pinned on a notice board for the information of the navigating officers, but not all the ice warnings were posted. An 11 a.m. warning had read, America passed 2 large icebergs in 41 degrees 27 minutes north, 50 degrees 8 minutes west on the 14th of April. A message received from the Mesaba at 9:40 p.m. stated, ice report in latitude 42 degrees to 41 degrees 25 minutes north, longitude 49 degrees to 50 degrees 30 minutes west. Saw much heavy pack ice and great number large icebergs, also field ice. Weather good, clear. Assistant operator Harold Bride was off duty, but chief operator Jack Phillips was snowed under with sending and receiving private messages. He put this later message to one side for subsequent delivery to the bridge. He was not to know that this message warned of ice directly in the path of the Titanic. At 11 p.m., the Leyland liner, Californian, was not far away, stopped and blocked in by ice. During the course of the evening, Phillips rebuked the Marconi operator on the Californian for interrupting his calls to Cape Race. Later, as he came off duty, the Californian's wireless operator switched off his set and turned in for the night. Captain Smith had been to a dinner party held in his honor in the restaurant. He returned to the bridge at 9 p.m. He discussed the weather and ice warnings with Second Officer Charles Herbert Lightoller. After 20 minutes, he went into the chart room, leaving instructions for him to be called if conditions deteriorated. Lightoller went off duty at 10 o'clock, handing over to First Officer Murdoch. Lightoller went to bed just before 11:30 after making his rounds of the ship. Up in the crow's nest, lookouts Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee were looking ahead in the bitterly cold wind. At 11:40 p.m., Fleet rang the crow's nest bell 3 times and picked up the telephone connecting him with the bridge. "Iceberg right ahead," he called. He described what he saw. The berg came ever closer. The ship then responded to Murdoch's emergency instructions. Hard a starboard, full astern, hard a port. The prow swung slowly across, and the iceberg passed along the starboard side of the ship before disappearing aft. It seemed like a near miss. But the iceberg had bumped along the ship's hull below the waterline, shearing off rivet heads, penetrating parts of the hull, and opening overlapping plate seams. A gash of between 250 and 300 feet long had been made below the waterline along the front part of the starboard hull. The whole impact had taken only 10 seconds. Many people on board didn't even notice the event. Others reported feeling a slight vibration. Some people came up on deck to see why the ship was now stopping. And on the third-class deck, men were seen playing football in the forward well deck, with some of the ice which had fallen from the towering berg as she passed. There was no clue to the imminent disaster. Captain Smith had rushed to the bridge and checked that all the electrically operated emergency watertight doors below had been closed, and ordered a quick inspection of the ship. It was only then that the enormity of the damage to her hull became apparent. The Titanic was divided into 16 watertight compartments and could float with any 2, possibly 3 or 4 of them, completely flooded. But this long, glancing blow meant that the 6 forward compartments were flooding. The bulkheads this far from the prow only reached up to the saloon deck, some lower still, and as the ship was weighed down with the seawater flooding in and began to sink by the head, the water would rise above these compartments to fill the next, and the next, and so on. It was inevitable that the Titanic would sink. Thomas Andrews, the ship's designer, confirmed this to Captain Smith. But still, the passengers were unaware of their imminent peril.
I was in bed, of course. And she just came and joined in whatever was happening during the evening, and that sort of thing. And my father got very cross, because he had every reason to dislike gambling. His father had been a compulsive gambler and had died utterly penniless from being quite a wealthy man. And so everybody was gambling on this Sunday night. They were making books, as in service, and having sweepstakes as to what time she would get in so many minutes past so and so. My father would have nothing to do with it. And so he went to bed quite early, for him anyway. And my mother sat down to sew and read. And she looked up at him, he was reading. He said he got a very interesting book. But quite quickly, he went to sleep, and she got up and took the book from him and settled down again. And she said at 10 minutes to 12, she felt a slight bump. And she said it was just like a train pulling into the station. It just jerked. It was very slight, but she said she knew that it was this dreadful something, and she wakened my father. She wakened me, and my father said no, he wasn't going up on deck again after the night before. But she literally pulled him out of bed and made him go up. And she then said she was going to dress me, and I, being sleepy and very naughty, said I wasn't going to be dressed. There was nothing to be dressed for. I came back to bed. My father came back very quickly because he could get up to the boat deck. in the lift very quickly from where our cabin was. And he came back and he picked me up and wrapped his blanket tightly round me as if I were a baby. And my mother said nothing to him, and I used to say to her sometimes, years afterwards, I can't understand why you didn't say to him, what was it? Which she certainly did not say. And she said, I didn't have to say, what was it? I didn't know what it was, but I knew it was this dreadful something that I had to live with for months. There was nothing more I could say. So he put his very thick coat on her and put another one on himself. And without any words at all, we went out of the cabin and into the lift and up onto the boat deck. Now, if we hadn't done that at that time, I very much doubt I'd be talking to you today, because, as you know, there was accommodation for less than 800 people in the lifeboats, and she was carrying 2,200. So it was a question as who was there in time to get into one of the all too few lifeboats. Well, they weren't launched very quickly, because at first no one thought anything was going to happen. But my father went away and spoke to an officer, and he said, they are going to launch lifeboats, but you'll all be back on board for breakfast.
Now began the general alert. Runners called through the ship for passengers to put their life jackets on and proceed up onto the decks. Some still thought this was merely a safety practice, even at near midnight. What distinguished this operation in its early stages was the quiet orderliness, with people remaining on the whole quite calm. It was a cold, clear, starlit night as people filled the decks. Those in the upper classes arriving before the greater numbers of third-class passengers who were berthed furthest away from the boat deck. The sea was a flat calm, but Captain Smith knew there would only be enough space in the lifeboats for half the people on board. Down in the Marconi room, the captain ordered the operators to stand by, then returned a few minutes later at 12:15 a.m. to tell them to send the International Distress Call, CQD. The position was estimated as 41 degrees 46 minutes north, 50 degrees 24 minutes west. At 12:25, this was changed to 41 degrees 46 minutes north, 50 degrees 14 minutes west, the revised signal being picked up by the liner Carpathia nearly 60 miles away. She immediately altered course and steamed towards the stricken giant. Just after 12:30, Captain Smith again came to the wireless room and asked what they were sending. CQD, Phillips replied. Harold Bride joked, "Send SOS, it's the new call. It may be your last chance to send it." Shortly after, the first lifeboat was lowered, containing only 19 or 20 people. No lifeboat drill had been given to passengers at any time on the voyage, and many crew were unclear about their lifeboat stations. But then Quartermaster Rowe began firing off distress rockets at 5-minute intervals, and people were now less reluctant to climb into the lifeboats being prepared for lowering. The evacuation of the ship now ceased to be so calm and orderly.
There wasn't any panic until the lifeboats left, and then there was panic galore. We were down on the ocean. We could hear them running about on the decks and screaming. You can imagine people came up from their cabin, went onto the deck, no lifeboat, tearing around the other side. That's when the panic was there. There wasn't any panic at the time I got in the lifeboat because there weren't enough people up there. And there were enough people there to just get into the lifeboats. But after that, when the others started coming up from their cabins and there were no boats, gosh, there was panic. We could hear it. Definitely.
The ship's band, led by Wallace Hartley, had been playing inside the liner. Now they moved out onto the deck and, almost incongruously, played jaunty ragtime tunes. As each lifeboat reached the water, it moved away from the ship, for fear of the suction should she sink. Some rowed towards the lights of a ship, which could be seen just a few miles away. But this ship was never identified and never reached.
And of course there are still threats of legal things even these days about whether the ship that was so close to us was the Californian or not. I mean, I saw that ship. It's terribly close. And the other thing I'm saying is that I didn't see a ship 19 miles away. I saw a ship that was so close. And they said at the time it was less than 9 miles away. Now they're trying to say it was 19. I saw it. You know, it wasn't just lights on the horizon. You could see it was a ship. And I saw our rockets being fired, which that ship must have seen. Well, this inquiry says that they did see it, but they didn't think it was a portent of danger. But I would have thought in the middle of the Atlantic, in the middle of the night, that rockets must mean trouble.
The Titanic's bow sank lower and lower in the water. Yet all her lights remained ablaze throughout, until very near the end. With great courage, every one of the liner's engineers stayed at his post in the bowels of the ship to keep the pumps, lights, wireless, and other functions operational. Women and children first was the rule for the lifeboats, but some men were allowed in as boats were hurriedly lowered and no ladies could be seen close by. J. Bruce Ismay, managing director of White Star, himself stepped into a partially filled boat. First and second class passengers were led to the boat deck. Third class had to find their own ways as best they could. At 1:30, a group rushed boat 14 as she was about to be lowered, and Fifth Officer Lowe had to fire his revolver along the side of the ship to quell them. At 1:40 a.m., the last rocket was fired. The last of the rigid lifeboats was lowered at 1:55. The boat deck now only 15 feet above sea level instead of her usual 62 feet. 2 of the collapsible boats were successfully launched. A third was launched at 2:05, by which time the forecastle was underwater and promenade deck A was awash. At about this time, Thomas Andrews, who had designed this great ship, was last seen standing in the first-class smoking room. He was standing, arms folded, life jacket off, staring straight ahead at a painting above the mantelpiece. The Approach to Plymouth Harbor by Norman Wilkinson. Captain Smith released the wireless operators from their duties, but Phillips carried on sending distress messages while the power held out. The captain then walked along the deck telling his men, "It's every man for himself." Incredibly, the lights still burned. At 2:10, she lurched and sank deeper. The last collapsible lifeboat and some men were washed off the deckhouse, and this lifeboat B landed upside down in the water, with no chance of righting it. Men clambered to at least stand on the upturned hull. The band now played a solemn air. Some say autumn, but popular belief says it was nearer My God to Thee.
Well, there's no question about the fact that they played, and there's no question about the fact that after we were down on the water and they were playing, they played one version of the hymn, Nearer My God to Thee, of which there are 3. I've had this out so many times. And the one they played was the one that was played in church some months after when I was with my grandmother, and I was so frightened I came out of church. I ran out. I knew the tune so well. But they won't have it. The Americans won't have it. People say, no, it's not. It was just ragtime, but it wasn't. It wasn't.
Now the stern rose out of the water. 2 4-inch diameter cable stays snapped, and the forward funnel crashed down to starboard, crushing the bridge wing and killing several people in the water. The wash it generated pushed the upturned lifeboat away from the ship. There were varying reports on how Captain Smith met his end. One claimed he committed suicide on the bridge with his revolver. Another that he swam up to a lifeboat with a baby in his arms, put the baby in the boat, then sank beneath the waves. And another that he simply went down with his ship. Perhaps he too had been killed by the collapsing funnel. But others say he swam towards the upturned collapsible lifeboat before turning away and disappearing in the darkness. 1,500 people were still on board, as now the bridge submerged. The stern rose higher in the air. Those in the lifeboats heard the terrible crashing sounds as boilers broke loose from their seatings and crashed down through the vessel, along with many tons of coal, baggage, and all the loose furniture and fittings of the great ship. At the same time, her lights went out, flashed once more, and then were finally extinguished. Now at least 100 feet of her stern rose to a near vertical position, which she held for a considerable time, silhouetted against the stars on the calm, clear night. The visible part of the ship apparently settled back slightly before it, too, disappeared beneath the sea. It was this settling that indicated the ship had broken in two.
And we rowed away from the ship as fast as we could, because one has to do that, because I believe the suction when a vessel goes down is absolutely enormous. And we rowed away, and I didn't close my eyes at all. I saw that ship sink. And I saw that ship break in half. And for so many years, people had argued with me about that. But now at last, it has been proven beyond all doubt that she did break in half. I know she did, I saw her. And the forepart went down nose first, and the stern of that ship stood up in the water for quite a long time, or it seemed a long time to me, and then heeled over. And we heard the dreadful sound of people drowning, which was, unbelievable. And then, because our lifeboat was so full, so overfull, the officers called all the boats together and transhipped some of us. One in that boat, and two in that, and three in that, and I got separated from another. And that was the most terrifying thing to happen to a child. But the most dreadful sound of all is the sound of people drowning. The screams. Absolutely ghastly. My mother used to say sometimes, she couldn't get me to talk about it for years, but if ever anyone did talk to me, I said that, she used to say yes. But do you remember the silence that followed it? And that's quite right. It says the whole world stood still that night. Once the lights had gone, the ship had gone, the sound had gone. That was dreadful.
Now there was nothing to do but wait for rescue. Among those standing on the upturned boat was Harold Bride, the wireless operator, who confirmed to his companions that the Carpathia was on her way. At 3:30 a.m., she was sighted on the horizon, firing rockets. And at 4:30, she was on the sea. The Carpathia arrived with the dawn, and by 8:30 had taken on board 705 survivors and 14 lifeboats, the rest being set adrift.
And we were picked up, as you know, in the morning by this little ship, the Carpathia. And the rescue of people from lifeboats in mid-ocean is quite a terrifying thing. These little boats, shall we say, draw up alongside, for want of a better expression, to what looks like an enormous vessel. She was quite a small vessel, the Carpathia, but she looked big from that. And then how do you get on board? You don't have a gangplank like you do when you're ashore. And so they opened a sort of, I don't know whether the word is right, a hatch in the side of the ship where the luggage used to be laid. And they threw down rope ladders, and people like my mother and other grown-ups had to climb up in mid-ocean up a swaying rope ladder, which she said was the most terrifying thing. The sailor behind sort of holding on. And then what can the children do? We didn't climb up a rope ladder. So they got these big luggage nets, and the mesh is very wide apart. It's quite a big mesh. Children would have slipped through it, small children. Anyway, our legs and feet would have gone through. So each child was put in a sack. And I remember being petrified when I was put in that sack, and it was tied round, and the sack full of these children were put into these huge nets, and quite safely, of course, hauled aboard. But that really was quite terrifying. And then having got on board, of course, I couldn't find my mother. And I didn't find her for hours, but eventually I found her. And I'm quite sure one of the most pathetic things must have been the whole of the next day, how these poor women, such as my mother, roamed about the ship looking to see if they could see the husband they left behind. But no one found anyone.
En route to New York, Captain Rostron only allowed official and personal messages to be sent from the ship by radio. Newspapers, thus denied hard copy, made up their own fanciful accounts of the disaster. It was only on arrival that the true story became known. And gradually the dreadful news of the disaster was released to the world. Memorial services were held on both sides of the Atlantic, while the crew were detained under virtual arrest until the official inquiries were carried out, their pay having been stopped from the moment of sinking. Controversy reigned over who was to blame, and whether the nearby ship, the Californian, could indeed have rescued everyone on board if only her wireless operator hadn't closed down his set 20 minutes before the collision with the iceberg. The lookouts certainly saw and counted the rockets, but thought these might have been company signals, used for identification purposes on ships still not fitted with radio, and they also appeared to be too low for a ship reportedly so near. The American inquiry placed blame for the disaster on J. Bruce Ismay, the fact that the Titanic was sailing at virtually full speed, 21 knots, at the time of collision, knowing there were icebergs in the area, and the lack of sufficient lifeboats. The English inquiry also blamed the speed and inadequate provision of lifeboats, but also cited Captain Smith. After this tragedy, ships were to travel on a more southerly Atlantic route, traveled slower, and always had lifeboat provision for all on board. 63% of the Titanic's first-class passengers survived, 42% of second class, and 25% of third class. 23% of the crew were saved, 705 in all, leaving 1,500 to perish in the icy seas of the North Atlantic. But the press of the day concentrated not so much on the loss of life and who was to blame, but on how British and American values of heroism, honor, and courage had been upheld throughout the tragedy. Men behaved as men should do. All heroes, every one. And on Captain Smith's reputed last words, be British.
It was the cry of the ship going down. Every man was hasty at his post. Captain and crew when they knew the worst.
For over 70 years, the Titanic lay undiscovered in the depths of the Atlantic. There were fanciful ideas that she would still be intact, that corrosion would be minimal, as she was at such a great depth, that she could be refloated. On September the 1st, 1985, the American naval research vessel Knorr from the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution discovered her. The Titanic had been found after 73 years. The scientist in charge was Dr. Ballard, and many fascinating photographs and video pictures were taken on this and a subsequent visit to the site in July 1986. The liner is broken into two main sections, but sits upright, with her funnels gone. She is severed just aft of her second funnel, and the stern section is 800 meters away. Much of the central section lies in shattered segments on the seabed. A silver memorial plaque has been left on the wreck as a mark of respect, and to honor her as an official grave to the hundreds who perished with her, and as a tribute to a disaster which should never have happened.
I entirely agree with my dear Dr. Ballard. words. He said the whole thing was a tribute to man's arrogance. And I agree with that. That man can be so arrogant as to build something and claim that it is undestroyable, if you like. It's the most arrogant thing to say. True, if the Titanic had struck rocks, or a tempest and storm and sunk, that would be one thing, but this was a ship that needn't have had any loss of lives. I think it's a very painful prospect. And as I say, all these years later, this interest is profound. And it's because there was no one least, and no one died. No one should have died. Had she had enough lifeboats with 2.5 hours and a very smooth sea, nobody would have died. And one life is worth more than the whole ship, surely. That is what I saw, that is what I remember. And hardly any of us now to share this memory, of course. I'm the only living survivor now that can remember it and get about, so to speak. But I don't think there's anyone that can really tell the whole story of it, except myself.
Coming up following Flicks with Patrick Stoner, it's the story of the Gulf War on Frontline. And then at midnight, Charlie Rose. That's all tonight here on TV 12.
Colorful, shapeless, invisible, poisonous, and more intelligent.